of the Sustainability Institute will share with us what they've been using in the Institute. And
no, I don't think I'm into that. No.
And that is working.
Thanks. This is the topic that I spontaneously gave Yanni when he called me. So I got a little bit frightened with these references to more practical afternoon. Because I was so excited when Yanni agreed to this topic, because I always find myself in places where I have to be practical and find solutions, and I can never breathe the fresh oxygen of theory. So sorry to disappoint you. Confronted with a lot of my work happens at a very, very local level, as has just been mentioned with the ISHAC, but also I do a lot of work at the global level with extraordinary networks that are addressing the challenge of the polycrisis, as Edgar Morin put it. And one of the things that I became very interested in was a whole range of new, fairly popular literature that is addressing the what next question. And there is a distinct sensibility that underpins this literature, which is somehow there's a change in era. Somehow we're in an interregnum. I like this phrase, thick present, actually. It's a good, another word for this interregnum. And it's an interregnum which I think really was brought about very specifically between 2007 and 2009, with three specific events that marked it. The first is 2009 itself was the first year since the Second World War that the global economy shrank. The second was in 2007, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, got the Nobel Prize. And the third is that as of 2007, the majority of the world's population live in cities. So I think these three are indicative of this wider polycrisis, which opens up, I think, a new dialogue with the future, reflected in a lot of this popular stuff. So I've tried to review some of this material. What I'm going to talk about is going to draw on this book that I published in 2012, but I updated in this journal. So I'm going to race through some of the core arguments in this article, which really is an attempt to both deconstruct and critique simplistic long-wave theory, which is being articulated at this popular level, and at the same time try and build a synthesis using long-wave theory with all its weaknesses, all its problems, all its scary possibilities of constructing nasty grand narratives which might delude us into the future. With those disclaimers, these are some of the texts that have been coming out. Allianz, a big global financial investor, talking about the sixth Kondratiev cycle. This is a bunch of Australians and Ernst van Weizsäcker talking about the sixth wave. This is a popular journalistic account written for business. This is Jeremy Rifkin. What more can I say? And this is Amory Lovins. So these are all invoking long wave cycles into the future to construct fairly simplistic formulations of what must happen now or what will happen, whether you like it or not. Other examples is Standard Chartered is using long wave theory, and this is a disenchanted banker who used to work for Chase, who is depicting the Japan slump writ large for the rest of the world as his revenge on the banking sector. But even the United Nations is moving into this big, long future cycle thinking. The United Nations World Economic and Social Survey, the Great Green Technological Transformation, all 300 pages of densely written stuff, 600 pages in the Green Economy Report, both of them pulling out big long-term projections to 2050 on how we should be spending $1 trillion a year to save the planet. Now, for me, this is the hard reality that is my starting point, which is the global crisis that we are in now, economic crisis. This is more or less how long it takes us to destroy 50% of our wealth in crises. This is 16 months. This was 2 months in 1929, 22 months in 73. What's that? 32 months in the tech crisis. So it's a fair, and we're bumping along the bottom as we go through this rather painful interregnum, where we are struggling to find the coordinates of the possibility of a transition to a more sustainable world. Reduced in a most ridiculous way to some basic numbers, the current world we live in, we consume about 8 tons per capita of stuff, emit 4.5 tons of carbon, and all the science tells us we should be shifting to a world of 9.5 billion people without destroying the planet by 2050, emitting 2.2 tons of stuff, of carbon, and consuming 6 tons of stuff, of materials. This is what the science says. It's not how we run the global economy. So how do we think about this? And this is where I think it is useful to start drawing on long-wave theory. So this is the most popular image in many of these texts, that somehow over the last 250 years, we've gone through these cycles, these technological cycles, each associated with a particular cluster of technologies, going through a rise and a fall, each one marked by a midterm crisis, with the possibility of a sixth wave. Okay, so that's the most popular discourse. I mean, even the mayor of Johannesburg, for example, talks about, I'd like my city to be a sixth wave city. So there's what's attractive about it is this kind of linear projection into the future, that somehow patterns are going to repeat themselves. And what my work does is try to work with this long wave theory and try to problematize it. Just to give you another example, this is from the Allianz report. This is a global finance house talking about Kondratiev cycles over this period and associating these cycles with the rolling 10-year yield in the S&P 500. So it's just the continuous repetition on scale in these popular texts of this thinking. So what I'm going to try and present to you is a synthesis of 3 different kinds of long-wave thinking which work at different levels. So I was attracted by what Roberto was saying. One is the socio-metabolic regime theory from Marina Fischer-Kowalski, who's based at the Institute for Social Ecology in Vienna, a huge literature. The second is the updated work on Kondratiev cycles by Charles Gore. And the third is the techno-industrial transition theory that we get from the Venezuelan economist Carlota Perez. Charles Gore up until recently was an economist at UNCTAD. So these are the texts and the titles of these texts. If you want to follow them up, 2 books and a journal article by Charles Gore. So I recognize fully that these long wave cycles must be worked with a serious qualifier, recognizing this radical contingency. Long wave theory creates, by implications, stories of the future based on perceived patterns from the past. And what matters, though, is not whether these are right or wrong, but the choices they shape in the present. It's not about faith that they're going to repeat themselves. And for me, that is why, as a social scientist, I'm interested in this radical contingency, because it puts state actors in particular at the center. Wherever there has been these major transitions, the state has played a decisive role, but that's always preceded by a reconceptualization of the nature of the state, and we haven't seen much of that in the current moment. So let me just summarize these conceptual frameworks. This is Marina Fischer-Kowalski's reconceptualization of the last 13,000 years of history from the point of view of metabolic flows of resources through societies. So for hunter-gatherers, we're talking about temporary spaces, meat, wild food, fire, over 100,000 years ago. But after the ending of the last ice age, we move into the agricultural revolution as we develop the technologies to start mobilizing soils, land, building materials, water, biomass, and the first permanent civilizations start to emerge. So for Marina Fischer-Kowalski and her colleagues, who have continuously built huge empirical databases on the mobilization of these metabolic resources through these eras, what they're interested in is the change in technologies that makes possible a completely different appropriation of natural resources to give rise to different forms of social organization. And we have seen these different transitions taking place. So 250 years ago, we moved into the industrial era. We now use fossil fuels, minerals and metals, 8.7 billion hectares of land. We extract 120 billion tons of stuff. We only use half of that, plus a lot of pollution. So this is a summary, if you like, of the mobilization of metabolic resources in the industrial era, which is giving rise to the environmental crisis we currently face and the start of what is referred to as the Anthropocene. So the argument is, given that we have seen metabolic transitions previously, we can only expect the possibility, or what Marina calls the unlikely possibility, of a transition to a more sustainable era, because we are going to eventually run out of cheap oil. We are going to run out of a whole bunch of resources that we have depended on to make the urbanized industrial era that we currently live in. So this is one set of long wave cycles, very long wave cycles, that is much more rooted in empirical reality because it's focusing on the mobilization of these metabolic resources over time than some of the popular literature that I refer to. And what I like about it is it problematizes from this metabolic perspective this conjuncture, which is where we are at the moment. So just to bring in another set of cycles, which are the Kondratiev cycles, which are more economic cycles, we're looking at the one that ended with the crash of 1929, and the second one that really takes off after the Second World War, with an interregnum that was only really resolved with the Second World War itself. Now, Kondratiev was a Russian economist who devised the first 5-year agricultural plan in the Soviet Union. He landed up like all good intellectuals in the wrong place, and then was shot on exactly the day, as legend would have it, that Stalin gave him a reprieve. But he did look back on economic history and saw a set of cycles. And this has been a very influential metaphor in a lot of this long wave theory. A lot of it is nonsense, like the Allianz report, but I think Charles Gore has really drilled down and taken it very seriously and tried to come to terms with a Kondratiev perspective on the current crisis in order to ask the question, what's the next long-term development cycle going to look like? So that's his question, and I'll just briefly explain his economic theory. This is a classic image of a Kondratiev cycle, where you have an economic growth cycle during what is called the spring-summer period, and then you go into a stagflation moment of crisis, driven by the fact that you have a price boom, driven in turn by the fact that there's overinvestment in the infrastructures that were seen to be necessary for the growth cycle. That overinvestment pushes up the price cycle, triggers a stagflation, state intervention to reorganize and resolve the crisis, and you move into a new growth cycle in the autumn-spring period until you get into a deflationary moment. And these are, Charles Gore shows that you can show through economic history a fairly consistent pattern. That in order to get out of the deflationary depression, you move into serious investments in infrastructures, normally mobility, energy, and communications. You overdo it, overheat, inflation, stagflation, reorganization, and you go through another cycle. So now, if we look back on the immediate period leading up to 2009, you could see this pattern fairly clearly. After the Second World War, period of Keynesian economics, welfarism, inclusion, decolonization, a kind of leveling out, up until the 1970s. 1973 oil crisis, the rise of neoliberal economics, the movement to that then leads to the dismantling of the welfare state, the dismantling of Keynesian economics, globalization, the information revolution, structural adjustment, and a period of exclusion, of growing inequalities, but of simultaneously global integration. So these two periods of inclusion and exclusion, almost 25, 2009 was almost to the year, the 25th anniversary of the first structural adjustment program in the developing world. So he argues that we have reached, that 2009 marks the end of a Kondratyov cycle. So now if you put this into, if you also, so if you just go back to the metabolic flows, if you incorporate these Kondratyov cycles into this broader metabolic picture, you still need to come to terms with the work of Carlota Perez, which is extremely influential in technology and development studies in many different parts of the world across many different traditions. And what Carlota Perez's book does is look at also a whole range of what she calls technological revolutions or socio-technical industrial transitions, starting with the Industrial Revolution, moving on to the age of steam, coal, railways, the heavy engineering revolution, the age of the automobile in the start of the last century, and then question mark. We are now in the fifth cycle, the information age. What is the nature of this crisis? Now, in order to understand this really important conceptual framework in this whole field of long-wave theory, you need to understand how she understands the driving force of these transitions. She argues that during the initial period, when inventions start to come to the surface, finance capital tends to crowd in around the new innovators and entrepreneurs, and that's what drives the bubble. The old institutions of society are not equipped to absorb the new technologies. Eventually, you hit a crisis, and she identifies a crisis, a financial bubble in every single one of those cycles. State intervention takes place to reorganize the institutions of society to absorb the new technologies. Finance capital is disciplined. Productive capital, who is happy with capital with dividends rather than capital gains, moves in, and you have a golden era. You have a period of steady growth, of more inclusive growth, of consolidation of the new technologies under the auspices of productive capital. So she identifies this pattern in all of these transitions, with a crisis in all of these transitions, followed by a golden epoch, and asks the question, what happens now? Her argument is, and we disagree with each other, is that we can expect the script, as she puts it, the script will be followed. It's going to happen. The ICT sector is now consolidated. It's going to drive the recovery. And oh yes, the planet is falling to pieces, by the way, and we'll do some environmental fix-ups. Don't worry, technology will solve the problem. That's her view. I disagree. I think there's enough evidence for what you could call a sixth wave, which is the mobilization of venture capital in particular around green tech, with the possibility of a crisis moment probably brought forward by runaway global warming and other environmental crises. So we have this continuous argument with each other, and she doesn't buy the argument. So if you bring all this together, this is the synthesis that I published last year, that you could argue that there is a set of metabolic cycles, and we are at a crisis point from a metabolic point of view. We have reached the end of an economic Kondratyov cycle. Charles Gore is right. We're in the midpoint crisis of the fifth techno-industrial surge, as she calls it now. We're not quite sure exactly what the coordinates are going to be of the next industrial cycle, but I'm arguing that it's going to have a lot to do with a shift of finance capital out of paper and into green tech. That there is sufficient evidence that the IT sector is consolidated enough and moving very fast into the infrastructure world through its smart city agenda, and that together with the investments in green tech, coupled to the impacts of the limits to the industrial metabolic cycle, is somehow going to condition how we think about the next long-term development cycle in a majority urban world if we ever get to 9.5 billion by 2050. So that's, if you like, in summary, my picture in a very, very, very crude summarized form of the different long-wave dynamics that I think could be mobilized to explain the current moment and to begin to think about shifts that may take place. I like the image provided by the multi-level perspective out of the Dutch School of Sustainability Science, who talk about the landscape level, which is really the big forces that I've been talking about now, a whole bunch of different socio-technical regimes, your energy system, your transport system, your mobility system, all of which are facing strain because they're configured for a previous era, they're under pressure, and that in turn creates the space for a whole set of niche-level innovations, which, if consolidated, can either displace existing regimes or the existing regimes, where they are sophisticated enough, absorbs those niche innovations and creates a response to the changing landscapes. So, to answer the question that I said I would answer, is long-wave theory useful? It's unlikely that long-wave patterns of the future will break fundamentally from past patterns, so that's a comforting thought to some extent. But if the long-wave patterns of the future are imprisoned by the past, life as we know it is going to end. So long-wave theories suggest what needs to change, and I think that's what's useful about the framework. What may already be changing, and I think I've shown how these patterns of long-wave thinking can help make sense of what's already emerging in a very, very messy interregnum. And most importantly of all, who may be giving meaning now to emerging futures, and why are they doing it in certain ways? That's my critique of the popular literature on long-wave. They are all articulating these dynamics in ways that suit a particular set of interest in a highly, highly contested environment, where I don't think it's about providing frameworks for decision makers. I don't think we live in that kind of rational world. The future is going to be the outcome of contestations about this dialogue with the future articulated in these long waves. So to end off with a quote from Gramsci, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. One of these is this popular nonsense on long waves that you find as people try and colonize the future. Thank you.